Welcome back to Voices of the Regenerative Decade here at One Earth Live. I'd like to welcome our next guest, Christopher Breedlove. Christopher Breedlove is an American designer, community builder, and experiential producer. He currently works as the Director of Civic Activation at the Burning Man Project, where he oversees the Burners Without Borders regional network and civic arts programs in San Francisco, California. Christopher believes in the mighty power of community, in people's inherent capacity to solve their own problems, and human-centered approach to design and solutions. So it's great to have you with us here today, Christopher.
Hey, thanks for having me, Becca. I always love what you're weaving together, so it's a pleasure to be here.
Fabulous. Well, yeah, thanks for taking the time. And you know that I love the work that you're doing in the world, so I'm glad that we get to have a conversation so people can find out more today.
Well, I think these are obviously really important times to have conversations. So while we all have ideally a little bit of time to be here, let's dive into these important things so that we can come out the other side feeling more alive and ready to go.
Great, I agree. So I'd love you to introduce yourself and maybe start to talk a little bit about how your work could be useful to those focused on planetary solutions and regeneration.
Yeah. So, I think you said in the intro, I currently work with the Burning Man Project, and a lot of my focus, actually all of my focus, is around what happens outside of the confines of our event. We really know that inside the container we create, people have these transformational experiences, and how do we as a community, support and facilitate the dreams and the activities that people create, beyond that orange trash fence that we call the edge of our Black Rock City. And so it looks like a few different things. People go out into the world and have different interests. Some of them are community builders, some of them want to do events, some of them want to make art, and some of them want to do civic engagement, which tends to be where my heart really lies, which is, how do we take the principles and the visions, and the values that we create in festival culture, and how do we then start to interact with other communities out there? And so a lot of that work tends to happen within Burners Without Borders, which I've been involved with for 13 years or so now. And, for me, that work tends to be the most interesting, because oftentimes what we end up doing is we end up taking this infrastructure from Burning Man, these skills that we learn by building art projects and theme camps and stuff at Burning Man, and we start to apply those in other contexts. And so, we started as a program in 2005 when a bunch of burners went down to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And over 9 months, they realized that all of the skills they had in, again, building events and festivals were immediately applicable to a disaster zone. And they were able to gift over $1 million worth of demolition work for free to local communities. And since then, burners keep on looking at that story and seeing their own reflection in it. And so, I get the honor of working with community members who are doing crazy work. Like, I don't know if you know about Global Coalition, but right now they're building sculptures with community members, and they're sinking them into the oceans, and they're doing coral regrowth restoration science on them. Or I love working with the Permaculture Action Network, which are some amazing community members who activate audiences after concerts and festivals around getting those audiences to get into the dirt and to do permaculture work. Or one more example is we're working with another project right now called the Footprint Project, which is taking solar infrastructure that they built for Black Rock City and are deploying it in post-disaster situations. And they just brought a solar trailer down to Matamoros, Mexico, and they are 75% powering the COVID clinic there in what you could call a refugee camp. And so it's really interesting, that's kind of my supreme honor, is kind of getting to survey the landscape and see what people are doing out there, and then bring these really activated community members together to learn from one another, to share with one another, to find resources, and to really kind of, in a way, do that weaving amongst these larger communities so that our impact out in the world can be that much greater.
Thanks, Breedlove. That makes me think about, I'd love to find out more about what's been happening in the Burners Without Borders kind of network with the COVID response. And I know you've been having some conversations around, mutual aid and and how the networks are starting to actually step up in a way that's supporting community. So I'm wondering if there's any particular projects or anything going on that you'd like to highlight that's happening within the networks at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, and that is both exciting and overwhelming at once. I think the interesting moment about COVID is that, suddenly every geography and every kind of subject area suddenly is activated around this. It's not just like going to a place that has an economic problem and trying to work on that, or not going to rebuild after a storm. All of a sudden the youth need work, the elderly, the immunocompromised, underprivileged areas, doctors, all of a sudden, like, everyone's in the mix. And so we've started doing these calls on Wednesdays called community roundups. And we bring in anyone who'd like to do a 5-minute presentation on their work. And we allow people to make asks for support. And then afterwards, we break people out into breakout rooms so that they can have deeper conversations on certain topics. And there have been some amazing projects that have come out of this. Like, to just mention maybe 3 real quick is there's a group called the Grassroots Aid Partnership, which is part of the Foamy Homies theme camp at Burning Man and also Dr. Bronner's. And they are making and giving away free food right now, both in North Carolina and San Diego, to anybody who's in need because of the economic crisis that's been part of this fallout. I think they're amazing. There is a group in the Bay Area called Safety Net Fund, and they realized that the creative industry and community in the Bay Area was already in a crisis because of housing costs and everything. And so really quickly, in a matter of weeks, they've been able to raise over $400,000 to support artists to be able to make their bills in the Bay Area. And so they're giving away these $500 micro grants to support artists and creatives, particularly who work in the event industry and others that can't find work right now because all of our events have closed. And what I love about them is they're starting to also think even more expansively around, $500 checks are great, but they're kind of a Band-Aid depending on how long this goes. And so they're starting to think about building skills trainings to help artists and creatives be able to adapt to the digital world so that we can, up-level our skills to whatever comes next. And one more project I will mention is that, there's this other really interesting conversation around mutual aid and dual crisis. And so finding out all these other networks out there that are also doing support, how do our festival communities, how does our Burning Man community start to integrate with these other groups, and starting to look at what the tensions and commonalities are between the Burning Man principles and mutual aid values, And so it's really, in a way, up-leveling what we're doing and learning how to integrate even more with other people who are close to what we do, but a little bit different. And, I just find that the more we can have those conversations, the more we're able to really give our gifts out there.
Thanks. We had a great conversation as part of a panel around how we can shift festival culture towards being more of a regenerative culture. And so to kind of riff off of that, I know Burning Man recently released their 2030 environmental sustainability roadmap. And I wonder if maybe it could become a regenerative roadmap, and just, would love you to share some information about how that initiative came about and some of the goals and how people can get involved with that. It's wonderful to see that Burning Man's choosing to step up and lead in this particular area at this time. It feels very important for where things are on the planet right now. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about what's happening in that front.
Yeah, well, I'm super excited about it. I think one of the really interesting things that's happening right now is that, the Burning Man principles were written in the mid-90s, and they really described what was going on in the event. And as we have gone through time and our community has evolved, we're starting to have new conversations around what some of these values mean. And so leave no trace has always been one of the prime values of Burning Man, and we've been really proud that we're able to be the largest Leave No Trace event in the world. But now there's this discussion of, what does Leave No Trace actually mean? Does it not just mean trash? Does it also mean things like carbon? Does it also mean things like, all of the impact that we create just by traveling to the event? And so I'm really proud of the organization that we released this roadmap. Like you said, it's over 10 years. And actually we have 3 very audacious goals in it. Goal 1 is to handle waste ecologically. and really look at the whole journey of waste in the event, not just as us as producers, but also with our participants. Goal number 2 is to be carbon negative, and to, in 10 years, actually be pulling more carbon into the earth through some of our projects, particularly at places like Fly Ranch, than we produce in the event. And that third goal actually points to what you were saying, which is to be regenerative. And that is going to be the hardest because it's also the most opaque, but really how we're starting to look at this is, we're doing a lot of work right now on measuring what our impact is, figuring out where our baseline is, starting to implement some of the easiest things to go with right away. And so some of the things we've already started to experiment with is how can we start to take some of our production infrastructure into solar, like all of our work lights? How can we work with groups like Ecozoic that are bringing biofiltration toilets to events? And now we're working with our community to really kind of make this 10-year goal around all 3 of these areas, because one thing we realize is that we can't do it by ourselves as an organization. We can shine a light and we can kind of point a direction, but we need participation from all the different elements of our community, both the people who come to our event and the people in our global network, for us to have the true brain power to solve such a complex problem.
Yeah, with how much impact and influence I think Burning Man has in so many people's lives across the world, it's such a positive step in the right direction, I feel, to really lead by example, as I said. So I'm very excited to see what unfolds with that initiative.
Well, I think just to add one thing is, I think what we're really excited about is there are so many amazing initiatives that are happening from people who go to the Burning Man event. And so it's also really about us kind of surveying what that is and bringing those people in to advise us and help us. Just 2 quick examples that I think are awesome is there's this network out there called Grow Soil. You can look it up. And what Grow Soil is it connects people who are creating food waste, which is all of us, and connects them with people who are creating compost in their own neighborhoods. And so being able to create compost, which is actually a carbon negative activity wherever you are, ideally in the world. And there's another one called Carbon Network, which is doing the exact same thing with people creating biochar, which is another great carbon sequestration technology. And so, what's exciting is we don't have to invent anything. I think we really have to do that listening and that learning from our community, and then learn how to integrate that into our operations.
Thanks, Christopher. So on that note, I understand that recently Burning Man purchased some property, Fly Ranch, which is just near the actual Burning Man site, and that potentially could be a lab or an actual place where you could start experimenting with some of these, I guess, more regenerative practices and technologies. Could you tell us anything about that particular project, and also any other specific projects you're involved with that are moving planetary solutions and regeneration forward?
Yeah, so thanks for mentioning Fly Ranch. It's a really amazing project. It's about 12 miles past where the Black Rock City event happens, and it's a 3,800 acre ranch with over 150 pools of water, both hot and cold, that come up on the land. And it's an amazing property because if you've ever been to the Black Rock Desert, it's very harsh. I've heard some people call it masculine because it's very intense, it's directive. And then, over the hill and 12 miles away is this lush, growing, wet space that I think in a lot of ways you could call feminine because it has so much life in it. And so it's really interesting to think about the kind of duality around these 2 pieces of land and what the same community can do in these places. One of the phrases we use around Fly is that it's a permanent home for a temporary community. And so how can we take the lessons and the community we've built through this iterative cycle and all of a sudden slow that down and not have it this like 2-week sprint, but actually extend that experiment year round and actually work with the seasons and work with the land and really listen to it. And so that's the first thing we did when we purchased the land is we had 2 environmental fellows go out on the land. And for the first year, we just listened. And we tracked the animals and we tracked the water and we tracked, the growth and figured out what's happening there. And since then, we've started to be able to do small gatherings. We do nature walks there on the weekend when we're allowed to have gatherings, and people can register on the website or look up Friends of the Black Rock. You can also do it there. And I think the really exciting thing that we have is this thing called the Laggy Design Challenge for 2020. And we just actually extended the application deadline into October. And so we're doing a design challenge around 5 subject areas, which is power, food, water, shelter, and waste regeneration. And so we're inviting anyone in the world to look at these subject areas and propose a project that could happen on the land. And we're going to be choosing at least 2 winners from each category. And each winner will get a spot on the land. They'll get, you know, an amount of stipend money to be able to produce the project, and then also access to Burning Man heavy equipment and volunteer networks to create these projects. And it's the first step for us to start to create that kind of long-term sustainable and regenerative infrastructure so that we can have larger events on this land. And also we can be really secure in saying that when we're out there, we're not being extractive, we're actually being additive. And, you know, I'm really excited about it because not only the technologies have to not only be functional, but they also have to be aesthetic. And I think that's a great thing that Laggy does, is that all of their projects are also pieces of art. And so if you want to do a project, let's say on solar, it can't just be a solar field, but it has to be a beautiful solar field. And so I really like this idea of mixing, you know, infrastructure, design, technology, and art together to kind of vision what the future of this land project is going to be. I'm super excited about it. I can't wait to see what the community is going to put together. And if you look up LAGI Fly Ranch on Google, you can find all of the information. You can take a digital walk around the land, and we'd love for you to apply an idea.
This brings up a thought around one of the topics we were discussing in the broader panel around festival culture and regenerative culture. And I'm wondering, you know, is there something innate within festival culture that makes it potent to move to regenerative culture that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think that I believe both things around it. I believe yes and no, but I'll go into the yes. And for me, the yes around that is that I think those of us who really dive in to the festival culture, it's because we see and experience a type of community and culture that it's hard for us to find elsewhere. It does exist. I'm not going to say it doesn't, because I definitely know it does. And I know eco-villages and all of these experiments are also doing that work, but there's something that's so vibrant around the community that develops a festival culture. And I also think those of us who have done a lot of production work in the festival world, it's like we get life from it, but after a while too, sometimes there's this question of like, oh man, do I have to build this thing and tear it down again? You know, like all of a sudden it feels like I'm wondering if I'm using my energy and my community's energy to the best of our abilities by this constant up and down cycle. And so I think that points towards that more regenerative world. And I think also as we start to become people of the land, you know, I think for a while when you go to land, you're new on it. And so you kind of bring yourself to it. But as you return to land, I think you start to have a conversation with land. Kind of like I said with Fly, we had to have that conversation. And I think, you know, festival culture is starting to get more rooted, at least if you're having your event in the same place, with the land we're in. And so we're starting to hear the conversation and the requests from the land. And I think the land is asking us to be stewards again. And to me, that's really exciting.
On that note, Breedlove, you know, at this time, I think we're obviously in an interesting pause. There's a little bit more silence, a little bit more time to actually, well, for, you know, for some of us to be able to actually listen into what is needed on this earth at this time, you know, and some would say this great pause is an opportunity for us to think about how we're moving forward as a civilization. So, you know, I'm wondering if you have any insights into, you know, if the earth could speak, what do you think she would say to us at this time? What do you think needs to be heard to inform us of how to move forward? And to kind of tail end on that, do you think there's some opportunity here for us to come back out into the world in a different way that's more regenerative?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, if we were going to listen, what is the earth saying to us right now? I mean, I don't want to speak for the earth, but I feel like the messages I'm getting, right? Because I'm sure there's a lot of messages, is really in that slowdown, and also the value in that. It's a double-edged sword being in production. It's like, it's such a sprint to get into that world, and then we get all that magic. But what happens when we slow down? And I think for us as the Burning Man organization, there's a lot of sadness and grief around not doing our event this year. Like, so many of us invest so much in it, but I think a lot of people are also starting to see the opportunity where all of a sudden we're not caught up in that annual cycle. And so all of a sudden we can take a step back and look at this sustainability roadmap we put out and really say, what do we have to put in place to even get there? And so I think, in this slowdown, the earth is asking us to think about what's most important. What's most important to our own health, what's most important to our community health. And I think that one of the opportunities that's happening in this moment is that because there's all this stress in the collective unconscious, we're starting to see where the cracks in the system are. And we're starting to see where the non-resilient systems really lay. And I think that's why this moment in a way feels so chaotic. It's like, oh my gosh, what's happening to the healthcare system and the transportation system and the food system and the water system and our government systems. And like, on one hand, we could look at that and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. It's all falling apart. But I think on the other hand, right, it's like, what a gift for us to see this right now. And especially as we think about maybe the COVID moment being training wheels for the greater stress that's going to come with the environmental crisis. Like, oh man, we could look at this also as what a blessing. And of course, there's so much pain and there's death and there's sickness, and that's real. And we don't want to minimize that at all. But we also have to take the moment and say, okay, how do we imagine that more beautiful world that we all know is possible? How do we weave that community now? How do we set up the paradigms now? And I do think the festival and the production communities are primed to be part of that answer, because I think a lot of us are experiencing the stress of a lack of leadership right now, like the whole world's stressed out and doesn't know what to do. And so leadership is flailing. And I think I said this in the panel, but I think producers and production people, we're used to working through the chaos. And so all of a sudden we're like, oh, I know this world. We have to think on our feet. We have to come up with solutions on the fly. We have to use what's around us. Duct tape and bubble gum is going to fix some of these solutions right now. And so I'm really excited to see what comes from this greater festival community, because if we choose to take this moment and listen, and if we take this moment to really have these conversations, which I think this conversation is part of it, right? Like, we're inviting more people in to have it, then I think whatever that dream we create inevitably is closer to coming into being after this. And when we return to normal life, and ideally normal life isn't what it looked like before, but it is a world that's more abundant and regenerative and community-based, because that's what we wanted when we were building festivals anyways. So how do we make the whole world feel more like a festival?
Bringing back the villages.
Yeah, the village building.
Really is about the recreating and re-inhabiting the village again, isn't it? Well, we are coming towards the end of our time. I would love to find out more about where people can find out more about your work.
Yeah, so there's a few different places, and I'll just list them real quick. If you go to burningman.org, you can find out what we're doing as an organization around education and virtual gatherings right now. If you want to find out more about Fly Ranch, you can go to flyranch.org, learn about the land, sign up to be someone who comes out on one of our work weekends or participate in the Laggy Challenge. You can also look up burnerswithoutborders.org, which has all of the projects happening around the world and has a ton of resources for you to learn how to build your own projects in the world. And then the last thing is if you look up Burning Man Regional Network, you can find over 150 communities around the world of burners doing activities at home. And so it really depends what your speed is, what your style is, what you're most interested in. We're really trying to create a really abundant field of opportunities for you to come into.
Thanks, Christopher. Well, I'm excited for when we get back out onto Playa. It's been quite a few years since I've been out there, as you know, because of my
I
own
know.
personal crisis around the lack of sustainability. So I'm really happy to see everything moving in this direction, and the community getting on board. So yeah, the future looks bright. Yeah, do you want to say something to that?
I just, yes, you know, yes, yes, yes. And again, you know, I'm almost saying this to myself as much to anybody else, but, you know, again, it is a reminder to really sit and listen and weave and dream in this time, because that's the gift that we have.
So yeah, any final wisdom on how we can best find our place living in harmony with the earth and maybe stepping into that earth stewardship role moving forward?
You know, I feel like for me, it's a reminder that yes, we have to innovate and we have to experiment and we have to create these new things and we have to use technology like the internet and drones and AI to do all of this. And so it's how do we find this balance of like dreaming into the future around all this new, but also remembering everyone who came before us who has always been doing this work. And so it's combining also that historical past around the people who started the environmental movement, the people who have been doing sustainability and permaculture work for so long, and all the way back to the indigenous communities that have been doing land stewardship so long, where they don't even need a word for regenerative because that's what their culture was originally. And I feel like for me, that's the greatest wisdom that I keep on trying to lean into, which is combining the future and the past to make the most abundant present.
Love it. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today. Christopher Breedlove, from Burning Man. And yeah, I super appreciate all the work you're doing culturally, and just within communities to really, I guess, move things forward on the edge of what's possible. So thank you for everything you're doing. And it's just wonderful to continue to collaborate with you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Becca. And I just, one last thing to say too, because I always like to acknowledge this is, you know, it is my supreme honor in the role that I get to play is that I am a servant for a community and I get to be the face of it. And what you don't see is this army of hundreds and thousands of dedicated citizens and experimenters and makers and doers. And so that's what I get to represent, and it's an honor, and I can't wait to see what we all do together next.
It is an honor, and we're very, very blessed to be a part of such an abundant, thriving, and hopefully regenerative community globally.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your time. I'm Becca Dakini, your host here at Voices of the Regenerative Decade. You've been watching Christopher Breedlove. Thanks for joining us on One Earth Live, and we'll see you in the next show. Thanks, Breedlove.
Bye.